When I was a kid, the Lecture mask by Distortions Unlimited was my favorite mask. I saw it in the back of Fangoria magazine, and I was lucky enough that the one costume shop in my city had it. I love the realism of the eyes. All my masks before that had big holes just cut out. I lost the mask years later in a house fire, so I decided to use Ed Edmunds' techniques demonstrated in his Monster Lab videos to recreate the mask. Here are all my supplies. I bought some cheap sculpting tools from Amazon, wet clay, and I made a wooden armature out of some scrap and made an outline of my head using a caliper to measure. And I got some Krylon gloss spray paint in leather brown. It's been a long time since I've sculpted anything, so I didn't want to trust my skills. To make sure I got the scale and proportions of my head right, I took a selfie of my profile. Then I made an outline of that and printed it. Then I used that to cut out a cardboard template to guide the shape of the clay. I began sculpting my lecture using a couple of reference photos of the Distortions mask that I had found online. It took me about 5 hours to sculpt. It's not exact, and I'm sure my finished details are nowhere close to Ed's, but I was pretty proud of the final sculpt, especially since I haven't worked with clay in years. It took almost 25 pounds of wet clay. I've since made a better armature that wastes less clay. I'll make a video on that later. So here it is, coated in Krylon, waiting to dry so that I can pour the plaster. I couldn't find any USG pottery plaster nearby, so I went to the hardware store and bought their plaster of Paris. It took almost a full 25-pound bag. I used Ed's technique of sifting in the plaster into cold water until tiny little islands formed. Another reason I built my new armature is because this one was made of a 1/4-inch plywood, and it started to sag under the weight of the clay and the plaster. That made my mold slightly curved instead of flat. Here's the mold with the clay cleaned out. I wish I had an assistant for that part. It wasn't too hard except for the pointy ears. Here's the latex poured into the mold. You can see that I had to use some dirty clay to build a little dam because the mold was curved from that weak armature. I already had a gallon of RD407 latex, but it was pretty old and I didn't think that it would be enough to fill the mold, so I bought a fresh gallon. When I opened them up, the old latex was definitely thicker than the fresh latex. I poured the fresh latex in first, and it didn't quite fill the mold. So I poured in the older stuff and gave it a stir inside the mold to keep it from sinking to the bottom. It seemed to blend pretty well. I poured the excess back into the containers after letting it skin for just over 45 minutes. And then I flipped the mold over to let it drip into a bucket overnight. And here's the mask after I powdered it and pulled it from the mold. Next, I need to paint it and put some hair on it. Here it is with the base coat for the flesh and the eyes painted white. And here's the final product. I didn't quite get the tones exactly right. I'm not the painter or the sculptor or the hair layer that Ed is, but I'm reasonably happy with the outcome, and I'm glad to have this mask back in my collection. And I'm grateful for all the knowledge and skill that Ed has shared with the rest of us.